Welcome to this deep dive. If you're joining us today, well, you're exactly the kind of listener we love.
Absolutely.
We like to call you the learner because you're naturally curious, you want the hard facts, but more importantly, you want to know how those facts actually apply to the reality of your day-to-day life.
You want the so what.
Exactly. You want the so what. And today, our mission is to extract the most practical, truly mind-blowing insights from a landmark book called Willpower. It's subtitled Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength by Roy F. Baumeister and John Tierney.
And we have a massive stack of source material from their research to go through today.
We really do. And we're going to distill it all down into actionable, life-changing knowledge.
It is a phenomenal text to explore. Because what we're really looking at here is a complete redefinition of something, every single one of us struggles with. And it's mapped out through decades of rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific study.
And I want you, the listener, to think about this for a second. Think about the last time you completely abandoned a diet you swore you were going to stick to.
Or think about the last time you snapped at a loved one after a really long, grueling day at work.
Yeah, or maybe you went on one of those late-night online shopping sprees, adding things to your cart when you absolutely knew you shouldn't be spending the money.
We've all been there.
Right. But what if I told you that wasn't a moral failing on your part? What if that was actually a biological failing?
That framing really changes everything, because for a very long time, psychology largely dismissed the entire concept of willpower as this quaint, outdated Victorian myth.
Like stiff upper lip kind of stuff.
Exactly. If you look back at the 19th century, people constantly talked about character building and untiring perseverance. It was all about moral fiber.
Right.
But by the 20th century, many social scientists and psychologists, including prominent behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, they started looking entirely for external causes for human behavior.
Like the environment.
The environment, economic incentives, deep unconscious forces. The conscious will was considered so scientifically unimportant that it wasn't even measured in modern personality theories.
It was basically treated like a ghost in the machine. Something you couldn't measure, so, why bother studying it?
Precisely. But that skepticism was fundamentally and permanently challenged by massive, irrefutable data.
And to understand the scale of this paradigm shift, we have to look at this breathtaking study conducted in Dunedin, New Zealand.
The Dunedin study is legendary.
It really is. Researchers embarked on a project to track 1,000 children from birth, and they followed them all the way to age 32.
Just the logistics of that are staggering.
Tracking 1,000 kids for over 3 decades. I mean, people move, they change their names, they drop off the grid. To maintain a study like that requires an unbelievable level of dedication.
It's widely considered one of the most thorough and comprehensive psychological studies ever conducted, because they didn't just ask a few questions every couple of years.
No, they rigorously observed them.
They observed the children, took detailed reports from parents and teachers, and systematically measured their childhood self-control at various stages.
And what they proved was nothing short of revolutionary.
It really was.
They found that a child's level of self-control was a substantially better predictor of their adult success than their IQ.
And even better than the social class they were born into.
Which completely upends the narrative that your destiny is written entirely by your genetics or your parents' bank account.
It does. The data was crystal clear. The children who exhibited high self-control grew up to be adults with significantly better physical health.
Across the board.
Across the board. They had drastically lower rates of obesity, fewer cardiovascular issues, and get this, even fundamentally better teeth.
Better teeth, because they actually brushed them.
Exactly. Financially, they had more money in the bank, better retirement savings, and they were much more likely to raise their own children in a stable 2-parent home.
And I'm assuming the inverse was true for the kids who struggled with self-control.
Sadly, yes. Among the group with the lowest levels of self-control in childhood, more than 40% had a criminal conviction by the time they reached age 32.
40%.
Compare that to just 12% for the high control group.
Wow.
The Dunedin study irrevocably proved that self-control is not a myth, it's not a metaphor, and it's not an illusion. It is a vital, measurable biological strength.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if willpower is real, and it is demonstrably the key to a healthy, wealthy, successful life, We need to know exactly how it operates under the hood.
We do.
In this deep dive, we're going to map out the mechanical realities of willpower. We'll explore where the energy comes from, how the tank gets depleted, and exactly how you can hack your own brain to build that stamina back up.
It's a fascinating journey.
So to kick us off, if willpower isn't just a metaphor, what is it? And to answer that, we have to talk about one of the most famous and frankly psychologically torturous experiments ever run.
The Radish experiment.
The Radish experiment.
Torturous is definitely the right word, but the methodology was incredibly revealing.
So imagine you are the listener right now and you're a college student volunteering for the study. You arrive at Roy Baumeister's laboratory.
And you're already hungry.
Right, because the researchers specifically instructed you to fast before showing up. So you open the door, you walk into a room, and you are immediately hit by the overwhelming, mouth-watering smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies.
And it's not a trick.
No, they were actually baking them right there in the lab in a small oven. So you sit down at a table, and right in front of you are the warm cookies, some chocolate candies, and a bowl of raw, unpeeled radishes.
A truly cruel juxtaposition.
It really is. Now, some of the students get lucky. The researcher says, go ahead, eat as many cookies and candies as you want.
The lucky group.
But the unlucky ones are assigned to the radish condition. The researcher tells them the treats are for another study. You are only allowed to eat the raw radishes. And then they leave the student completely alone in the room with the warm cookies and the radishes.
What's fascinating here is the lengths the researchers went to in order to maximize the psychological temptation. Because they didn't just tell them no and stand over them with a clipboard.
Right, that would be too easy.
They left them alone and watched them through a hidden two-way mirror. And the observational data of the radish eaters is incredible. They clearly deeply struggled.
I mean, I would too.
They gazed longingly at the cookies. Some physically picked the cookies up just to smell them, breathing in the chocolate before putting them back.
Oh, man.
A couple of students accidentally dropped a cookie on the floor and quickly scrambled to put it back on the plate so the researcher wouldn't know they were flirting with the temptation.
But the key point is, none of the radish eaters actually took a bite.
True.
They all successfully resisted the temptation. They used their willpower. They did exactly what was asked of them.
Correct. But then comes the second phase of the experiment, which is where the real discovery happens.
The puzzle phase.
Right. Both groups of students, the cookie eaters and the radish eaters, are taken into a different room. They're given geometry puzzles to work on.
And the researcher tells them it's a test of cleverness and spatial reasoning.
But that's a lie. The puzzles are actually completely impossible to solve. There's no solution. The researchers simply want to measure perseverance. They want to see how long the students will keep trying before they get frustrated and ring a bell to give up.
And the results here are staggering. The students who got to eat the cookies, who didn't have to exert any willpower in the first room, worked on the impossible puzzles for an average of 20 minutes.
Which is a solid effort for an impossible task.
But the radish eaters, the ones who had spent all that mental energy resisting the chocolate, they gave up in just 8 minutes.
An 8-minute threshold compared to 20 minutes is a massive, statistically huge difference in the context of a controlled laboratory behavioral experiment.
It's less than half the time.
Exactly. And the implication fundamentally changed psychology. Willpower operates quite literally like a muscle that fatigues with use.
Wow.
The radish eaters had successfully resisted the cookies, yes, but that very effort had completely drained them. It left them with significantly less cognitive energy to tackle the frustrating puzzles.
That totally reframes how we think about our daily energy. You're not just tired because you didn't sleep well. You're tired because you've been resisting things all day.
Exactly. And interestingly, this discovery circled the psychological community all the way back to an old idea from Sigmund Freud.
Freud? Really?
Yeah. Freud had long theorized that the self depended on mental activities involving the transfer of a specific type of energy. Now, many of Freud's specific mechanisms, like his complex theories of sublimation and the Oedipal complex, were later proven entirely wrong by modern science.
Right, we don't really use those anymore.
But his foundational energy model, the idea that the self runs on a depletable resource, was actually spot on. Because restraining impulses takes literal energy, Baumeister adopted Freud's term for the self, the ego.
Hence the term.
Thus, this phenomenon of diminished capacity to regulate our thoughts, feelings, and actions was officially named ego depletion.
Ego depletion. If you are listening to this on your commute or while doing the dishes, I want you to really lock that term into your mind. Ego depletion.
It's central to everything we're discussing.
Because understanding it leads to what I think is the most crucial realization of this entire deep dive. You do not have separate willpower tanks for different areas of your life.
That is a very common misconception.
Yeah.
People think they have a work tank, a dieting tank, and a relationships tank.
Right. You think, well, I used up all my work discipline today, but I still have my exercise discipline ready to go.
But no.
No. It all comes from the exact same single biological reservoir. And to illustrate just how interconnected this is, let's look at Amanda Palmer.
The musician.
Yeah, before she became a famous musician with the Dresden Dolls, she spent 6 years working in Harvard Square as a street performer, specifically as a living statue called the 8-Foot Bride.
I remember seeing pictures of that.
She would paint her face stark white, put on a wedding dress, stand on a milk crate, and remain utterly, completely motionless for hours at a time.
And being a street performer in a busy public square means she faced incredible provocations. Drunks would deliberately try to tip her over.
Which is terrifying.
People would yell insults in her face, try to make her laugh, or do much worse. She recounted a story where a drunken fraternity brother literally came up and aggressively rubbed his head into her crotch.
Oh my God.
Yet she didn't break character. She didn't flinch. She used immense self-control to just let the experience pass through her without a physical reaction.
She couldn't scratch a sudden itch on her nose. She couldn't swat a mosquito biting her arm. She couldn't yell at the guy harassing her.
Total restraint.
And what she found was that even though she wasn't moving a single muscle, she wasn't running a marathon or lifting weights, the physical toll of that non-reactivity was profoundly exhausting.
Because of the ego depletion.
Exactly. She would stand still for 90 minutes, take a quick break, do another 90 minutes, and she would go home barely alive. She would literally crawl into the bathtub, and her brain would be completely blank.
She hadn't been burning physical energy in the traditional biomechanical sense, but she was massively depleting her single willpower reservoir just to maintain that rigid stillness.
It makes so much sense when you frame it like that.
And when you pull back and look at how this affects society at large, this single reservoir theory explains so much of everyday human behavior. It perfectly explains why married couples are statistically far more likely to get into explosive arguments after a long, stressful day at the office.
Oh, the after-work fight. We all know it.
Throughout the day, they've spent all their willpower dealing with frustrating commuter traffic, biting their tongue when a colleague says something annoying, meeting the demands of their bosses.
Keeping the peace.
By the time they walk through the front door at 6 p.m., they have absolutely nothing left in the tank to overlook a partner's minor annoying habits.
Like leaving shoes in the hallway.
Exactly. Don Bauckham, a veteran marital therapist, actually used to advise his clients to leave work early. Not to give them more hours in the day to fight, but to get them home and interacting with their spouse before their willpower reservoir was entirely drained by the workplace.
It also explains what researchers fondly refer to as the dirty socks phenomenon.
I love this study.
Daryl Bim, a famous psychologist at Stanford, once joked that during the semester, students could either get their homework done or change their socks every day, but they simply didn't have the capacity to do both.
It sounds like a joke, but it's real.
Well, later researchers, Megan Oten and Ken Chang, decided to actually test that joke in a clinical setting. They tracked students during college final exam weeks, and they found that during finals, students didn't just study more.
Because their single willpower reservoir was being completely drained by the stress and focus required for exams, every single other good habit in their life fell apart simultaneously.
The behavioral collapse was comprehensive.
Comprehensive is the word. During finals, these students ate 50% more junk food. The ones who smoked significantly more cigarettes.
They drank twice as much caffeine to stay awake.
But notably, they didn't reduce their alcohol intake to compensate. And yes, their personal hygiene plummeted.
The dirty socks.
They stopped brushing their teeth as frequently, they skipped shaving, and they wore dirty clothes and unwashed socks. Their single willpower tank was empty, so the discipline required for basic hygiene simply vanished.
Which naturally leads to the million-dollar question for anyone listening. How do you know when your tank is empty?
Right.
Does a little warning light go off in your vision? What are the actual symptoms of ego depletion?
To figure that out, Michael Inslicht and Jennifer Gutzel at the University of Toronto brought subjects into the lab and hooked them up to EEG machines.
Those snug caps fitted with dozens of electrodes.
Exactly. The ones that measure electrical activity inside the brain. They were specifically monitoring a region called the anterior cingulate cortex.
The anterior cingulate cortex? What does that actually do in plain English?
Think of the anterior cingulate cortex as the brain's internal check engine light, or its error detection system. It is the specific part of the brain that sounds the alarm if there is a mismatch between what you consciously intend to do and what your body is actually doing.
Okay, so like if I'm holding a cheeseburger in my right hand and my smartphone in my left hand, and I absent-mindedly try to take a bite out of my smartphone.
Exactly.
The anterior cingulate cortex is the part of my brain that screams, abort. That's glass, not a bun.
Precisely. It monitors for behavioral conflicts. So that the researchers induced ego depletion in their subjects.
How to do that?
They did this by having them watch incredibly sad documentaries about dying animals.
Oh, that's rough.
But instructing them to completely suppress any emotional reaction. No crying, no frowning, just a blank face.
It takes massive willpower to suppress that empathy.
It does. Afterward, when they gave these depleted subjects cognitive tasks, the EEG scans showed something remarkable. The electrical activity in the anterior cingulate cortex had actually slowed down. The brain's alarm signals were physically weaker.
Wow.
But here is the critical, counterintuitive part. You don't necessarily feel depleted or empty.
This is huge, because I always assumed I'd feel tired. But extensive studies looking for a specific universal emotion of depletion came up empty. You don't feel hollow. Instead, what happens is that you feel everything more intensely.
Exactly. Ego depletion doesn't turn the engine off. It just removes the shock absorbers.
That is a great way to put it. You feel sad movies make you significantly sadder than they normally would.
Right.
If you put your hand in cold water, it actually feels physically colder and more painful to you than it would in the morning. A joyous picture makes you irrationally happy.
And most dangerously, your cravings intensify.
Oh, yeah.
If you are ego depleted and you see a cookie on the counter, the desire for that cookie becomes utterly overwhelming. So if you're trying to resist temptation, you actually feel the forbidden desires more strongly at the exact biological moment. Your brain's ability to resist them is at its absolute weakest.
That's a brutal double whammy.
It is a profound vulnerability, and it perfectly explains why the withdrawal process is so incredibly difficult and relapses are so common for addicts. An addict is using massive, continuous amounts of willpower to break the habit of using a substance. This puts them in a state of intense, prolonged ego depletion.
Which in turn makes every other feeling, frustration, and craving drastically more intense.
Exactly. Making the substance they're trying to avoid seem infinitely more appealing.
Which brings us to our next major question. We know willpower is this single, depletable energy source. But what is the energy? Where does the power actually come from?
And the answer to this was discovered completely by accident.
I love this story. It's through something researchers called the Mardi Gras theory experiment.
The premise of the Mardi Gras theory was cultural. Before Lent, in the Christian tradition, which is a long season of fasting, self-denial, and discipline, you have Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras.
It is a day of shameless indulgence, partying, and gluttony.
Psychologists theorize that perhaps this cultural period of happy self-indulgence allowed people to essentially store up the psychological willpower necessary to sustain themselves through the upcoming weeks of sacrifice.
Makes logical sense on paper.
Right. So to test if experiencing pleasure restores willpower, the researchers in Baumeister's lab created a two-part depletion task. In the middle, as a rest period, they whipped up luscious, thick, incredibly delicious ice cream milkshakes for the subjects.
Because who doesn't feel a surge of joy from a great milkshake?
Exactly.
And the results seem to validate the theory. The milkshake group performed much better on the second willpower task than a control group who spent their break stuck reading dull, out-of-date magazines.
So, the researchers patted themselves on the back. They thought they had scientifically proved the Mardi Gras theory that pleasure restores the ego.
But being good scientists, they had a third control group to establish a baseline.
They did.
They had this third group drink a large, tasteless, unflavored concoction of low-fat dairy glop. It was scientifically rated by the subjects as being even less enjoyable than reading the old magazines.
It was essentially just a bland caloric paste. And to the utter horror of the graduate student running the study, the data came back showing that the joyless, disgusting dairy glop worked exactly as well as the delicious ice cream milkshake.
I love when science accidentally breaks its own hypothesis.
It was a failed experiment regarding the pleasure hypothesis, but it yielded a massive, world-changing accidental discovery. It wasn't the pleasure or the joy of the milkshake that restored the willpower.
It was the calories.
Specifically, it was the glucose.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's dig into that glucose connection, because the human brain is an absolute physiological marvel, but it is also an incredible energy hog.
It really is.
The adult brain makes up only about 2% of the body's total weight, yet it consumes more than 20% of the body's resting energy. And the specific fuel it runs on is glucose, the simple sugar manufactured in the body from the food we digest.
When glucose levels in the bloodstream drop, willpower drops. Your cognitive ability to regulate your behavior is directly tethered to your blood sugar.
Which is wildly apparent in people with hypoglycemia.
Yes. Individuals with hypoglycemia chronically tend to have more trouble concentrating and controlling negative emotions when their blood sugar dips.
A great real-world example of this is the comedian Jim Turner. He has diabetes, and he actually incorporates the reality of glucose depletion into his stand-up routine.
His story is terrifying but illuminating.
It is. He tells this incredible story about a time he had a severe low blood sugar episode. His brain was so starved for glucose that he became completely manic and detached from reality. He became absolutely convinced he had suddenly acquired the superpower of teleportation.
Teleportation.
Yes. He was jumping around his bedroom, doing somersaults onto his bed, shouting at the top of his lungs that he could travel anywhere in the world just by thinking about it. Thankfully, his wife recognized exactly what was happening. She physically forced him to sit down and drink a large glass of fruit juice.
And the physiological response is rapid. The sugar in the juice was digested, converted into glucose, crossed the blood-brain barrier, refueled his anterior cingulate cortex, and entirely restored his self-control and his grip on reality within minutes.
But it's not just funny stand-up stories. There is staggering, sobering data connecting glucose to extreme behavioral outcomes. Researchers in Finland conducted an incredible study where they went into a prison and measured the glucose tolerance of convicts who were nearing their parole dates.
Glucose tolerance being the body's biological ability to properly absorb and convert glucose from the bloodstream into usable cellular energy.
Right. And the results of that study are chilling. Just by looking at the medical results of those glucose tests, nothing about their criminal background, their psychological evaluations, or their childhoods, the researchers were able to predict which paroled convicts would go on to commit violent crimes after release with greater than 80% accuracy.
80%, that's a massive correlation.
Their bodies simply could not process the fuel required for their brains to exert impulse control in high-stress situations.
Now, when we talk about blood sugar and extreme behavioral outcomes, we have to mention one of the most infamous cultural touchstones for this idea. The 1979 trial of Dan White for the tragic assassinations of San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk.
Right. The popular cultural narrative, what everyone thinks they know, is that White's lawyers used a Twinkie defense, basically arguing to the jury that eating too much junk food directly caused him to grab a gun and commit murder.
Yes, and to ensure we are looking at this impartially and purely through the lens of the psychological history provided in our source material, without taking any political stance or making moral judgments on the trial, the verdict, or the deep tragedy of the assassinations, it is important to clarify what the defense actually argued.
Which was not that sugar caused the murders.
Exactly. The legal team did not argue that sugar caused the murders. Rather, they argued that White's massive consumption of sugary junk food, which was entirely out of character for him as a normally health-conscious person, was behavioral evidence of a deep, pre-existing clinical depression.
They used this dietary shift to claim he suffered from diminished mental capacity.
Regardless of the legal strategies used or the intense, entirely understandable public outrage surrounding the lenient verdict, that specific trial permanently injected the concept of blood sugar affecting human behavior into the mainstream public consciousness.
It put the phrase blood sugar on the front page of every newspaper. And stepping back from the courtroom into the everyday biology of glucose, we see its invisible effects everywhere. Think about what happens when you get sick with a severe cold or the flu.
Your body goes to war.
Your immune system suddenly detects a threat, and it needs massive amounts of glucose to manufacture white blood cells and fight off the infection. It aggressively rations your body's energy, leaving very little fuel for your brain.
This is exactly why you sleep so much and feel a profound brain fog when you have a cold.
It is a systemic energy diversion, and it is why driving a car with a bad cold has actually been found in simulator studies to be even more dangerous than driving while mildly intoxicated.
You simply do not have the glucose available in your brain to maintain focus, track multiple variables on the road, and exert the rapid reaction time necessary to avoid an accident.
This concept of biological rationing of energy is also the definitive scientific explanation for premenstrual syndrome, or PMS.
Yes, during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, which is the period roughly a week or two before menstruation begins, the female body channels a massive, disproportionate amount of its energy resources to the reproductive system to prepare for a potential pregnancy.
So the brain is left lacking.
Because so much systemic energy and glucose are diverted downwards, the brain essentially gets shortchanged. And the measurable result is that, across the board, executive function and self-control take a significant dip.
It's so validating to hear that it's not some mysterious, emotional, alien impulse taking over. It's not a character flaw. It is just a raw lack of fuel.
Studies explicitly show that during the luteal phase, women spend more money, make more impulsive consumer purchases, smoke more cigarettes, and drink more alcohol.
But there is one very notable, fascinating exception in the data. They do not increase their use of marijuana.
That exception proves the rule regarding ego depletion. Alcohol, nicotine, and cocaine are generally classified as drugs of escape, numbing, or euphoria. They suppress negative feelings.
Right.
Marijuana, however, due to its specific psychoactive properties, tends to act as an amplifier. It intensifies whatever emotional state you are already experiencing.
And since PMS generally feels physically and emotionally unpleasant, a drug that intensifies that feeling isn't attractive at all.
Exactly. The increase in alcohol or impulse shopping isn't a specific, reckless desire to be bad. It's a systemic failure of the biological self-control mechanisms due to an energy shortage, combined with a desperate attempt to find a quick hit of dopamine to feel better.
Makes sense.
One fascinating dietary study found that the average woman actually eats about 810 calories at lunch during the luteal phase, which is roughly 170 calories more than her baseline, simply because her body is desperately chemically demanding more fuel to cover the deficit.
So, if you are listening to this right now, how do you apply this to your life? The primary actionable advice is simple. Feed the beast.
Feed the beast.
If you have a massive project to tackle, a high-stakes standardized test, or a stressful negotiation meeting at work, do not go into it with low blood sugar. Fasting before a test of self-control is a recipe for failure.
And for the love of your marriage or your relationship, do not initiate a serious, heavy talk about finances or your future with your partner 4 hours after lunch or right before dinner when you're both starving.
Anger is real.
You are literally setting yourselves up for an explosive fight simply because neither of you has the biological fuel required to regulate your emotions and listen empathetically.
But we should clarify how you feed the beast. While researchers in the lab use glasses of sugary lemonade for a quick, observable 10-minute spike in glucose to run a test, that is a terrible, counterproductive strategy for daily life.
Right, because if I eat a massive candy bar right now, I don't feel like a Zen master of self-control.
Yeah.
I usually feel jittery for 20 minutes, and then I completely crash and want to take a nap.
So how does sugar actually fix willpower if it makes me feel worse an hour later?
Because a rapid sugar spike triggers an aggressive insulin response from your body, which pulls the sugar out of your blood too quickly, inevitably followed by a crash, leaving you more depleted and ego-exhausted than before you ate the candy.
Okay, so candy is out.
If you want to maintain willpower throughout the day, you need foods with a low glycemic index for a slow burn.
We're talking about complex carbohydrates, proteins, and healthy fats. Nuts, raw fruits like apples and blueberries, cheese, and vegetables.
These foods break down slowly in the digestive tract, providing a steady, sustained, trickling supply of glucose to the brain, which keeps your willpower reservoir stable over hours rather than minutes.
Okay, so we've comprehensively covered the biological engine of willpower. We know it needs glucose, but what if the engine has plenty of fuel, but the gears are just completely jammed up with junk?
The mental clutter.
Exactly. That brings up a massive psychological hurdle, the mental clutter of uncompleted tasks. Let's move into segment 3, the Zeigarnik effect and the to-do list.
This is where it gets really practical.
If you've ever had a catchy pop song stuck in your head, specifically because you only heard the first half of the chorus before turning off the car, or if you've ever felt a low-level humming anxiety about all the uncompleted chores floating around in your brain while trying to fall asleep, there is a scientific reason for that.
And it starts with a great story from the 1920s about a waiter in a beer garden in Berlin.
I love this origin story in psychology.
A young Russian psychology student named Bluma Zeigarnik and her brilliant mentor, Kurt Lewin, were relaxing at a restaurant. They observed that their waiter had a seemingly superhuman memory.
He could remember incredibly complex orders for large tables. Who had the schnitzel, who wanted extra sauce, who had the dark beer, perfectly without writing a single thing down.
But as soon as the food was served and the bill was paid, he instantly forgot everything.
Unbelievable.
When Zygarnik and Lewin went back inside just minutes after paying to ask him a question about their tab, he looked at them blankly. He had absolutely no memory of them or what they had ordered.
His brain just dumped the files into the trash the second the transaction was complete.
Exactly. This observation led Bluma Zygarnik to conduct decades of rigorous research, confirming a phenomenon that became known as the Zygarnik effect.
The Zygarnik effect.
Uncompleted tasks and unmet goals tend to pop into your conscious mind constantly. The mind treats them as dangerous, unfinished business and keeps aggressively inserting reminders into your stream of conscious thought, disrupting whatever else you are trying to focus on.
For decades, psychologists assumed that the unconscious mind was just nagging you to get the job done right that second, like a toddler pulling on your pant leg saying, "Do it now, wash the car, pay the bills."
But a researcher at Wake Forest University named E.J. Masacampo discovered a massive twist that changes how we should manage our lives.
He ran an experiment where he gathered a group of college students and deliberately reminded them about a highly important, very stressful upcoming final exam.
Then, to test what was hovering in their unconscious minds, he gave them a series of word fragments to complete.
A word fragment test is a classic psychological tool. You give someone a prompt, like RE blank blank.
Right. And the students who were just primed to be stressed about the upcoming exam were much more likely to complete the fragment as READ for read.
Whereas a control group that wasn't stressed might write REL for real or REST for rest. The stressed students' unconscious minds were aggressively pushing study-related thoughts to the surface of their consciousness.
But the twist occurred when Masacampo took another group of students, reminded them of the stressful exam to trigger the Zygarnik effect, but then instructed them to take a piece of paper and make a highly specific plan of what, where, and when they would study.
For example, I will study chapters 3 and 4 at the library at 7 p.m. on Tuesday.
After making that specific plan, when they were given the exact same word fragments, the study-related words completely vanished from their responses. Their minds were entirely clear.
Which is mind-blowing because they hadn't actually done any studying yet. They hadn't completed the task. They were no closer to passing the test than they were 5 minutes ago. But the nagging stopped. Why?
Because the unconscious mind isn't actually nagging you to do the task right now. It is simply nagging you to make a specific plan.
It wants a plan.
Your unconscious is smart enough to know you can't do everything at once, but it is deeply afraid you will forget. Once a concrete, actionable plan is made and written down, the unconscious trusts the conscious mind to handle it at the appointed time, and it stops draining your willpower with constant low-level anxiety.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of our lives, it explains why traditional planning methods often fail so miserably, and why we suffer so deeply from having conflicting goals.
Think of Benjamin Franklin, one of the most productive men in history.
He famously created a grueling 13-week chart to achieve complete moral perfection. He tracked 13 virtues like temperance, frugality, industry, and silence. He carried a little book and would mark a black spot for every failure.
But even Benjamin Franklin found he was constantly failing and covering his book in black spots because his goals inherently conflicted with one another.
If he rigorously practiced frugality by spending hours mending his own old clothes, it cost him the valuable time he needed to practice industry at his printing job.
And today, in the modern world, our goals are exponentially more complex than Franklin's. Psychologists Robert Emmons and Laura King conducted studies and found that the average person typically has at least 15 separate active goals at any given time.
15.
When those goals conflict, like wanting to excel and work late for a promotion, while simultaneously wanting to be home by 5 p.m. to be a present parent, people don't just get less done.
They worry more.
They worry more, they ruminate constantly, and they actually get physically sick from the chronic stress. The data shows they visit the doctor more often and report significantly more psychosomatic illnesses. You get stuck in the mud of conflicting desires, and your willpower reservoir drains to zero just from the friction.
We also have to consider the time horizon of our goals. How far into the future are we looking? Psychiatrists in Vermont ran a fascinating experiment where they asked people to finish a fictional story about a character who was thinking about their future.
For the control group of average healthy adults, The time frame they naturally imagined and wrote about covered about 4.5 years into the future.
But when they gave the exact same prompt to heroin addicts at a local treatment center, the addict's vision of the future extended only 9 days.
Addiction literally shrinks your temporal horizon. Your brain cannot conceptualize a future beyond the immediate need for the drug.
Which is why, for healthy goal setting, you need a balanced mix of distal goals, meaning long-term, far-off aspirations, and proximal goals, meaning short-term, immediate tasks.
A famous study by psychologist Albert Bandura showed that children who were severely struggling with math did much better when they were guided to set proximal goals, like, I will finish exactly 6 pages of math problems this afternoon, rather than a distal goal of, I will finish 42 pages over the next 7 sessions.
The proximal goal was manageable and didn't trigger an existential panic.
But conversely, high schoolers looking at their grand distal life goals, like getting into a specific college or becoming a doctor, were actually more motivated in their daily studies than if they only focused on the next test. You have to balance the fuzzy, distant dreams with the fussy, immediate tasks.
An excellent, almost ruthless example of this balance was presented by a female military general when a researcher asked her to summarize her entire resource and time management strategy in 25 words or less.
She didn't offer a complicated matrix.
She just said, first I make a list of priorities, 1, 2, 3, and so on. Then I cross out everything from 3 on down.
It sounds incredibly simple, almost overly so, but from a neurological standpoint, it is brilliant. It effectively eliminates the paralysis of conflicting goals. By crossing out priorities 4 through 10, she is explicitly telling her unconscious mind, we are not doing these. Stop nagging me about them. It preserves her willpower for priorities 1 and 2.
Which perfectly transitions us to the modern master of the to-do list, David Allen, and his globally famous system called Getting Things Done, or GTD.
There is a great story about the comedian Drew Carey here.
At the height of his fame, starring in his own sitcom and hosting Whose Line Is It? Anyway, Carey was so entirely overwhelmed by the literal physical piles of unanswered fan mail, unread scripts, and general chaos covering every surface of his office that he felt paralyzed.
He paid David Allen $20,000 to personally sit in his office with him for a year and help him clear it out.
Carey said he constantly felt this subliminal, humming anxiety. He was unable to even sit and read a book for pleasure without feeling a crushing guilt about his overflowing inbox.
David Allen views that exact feeling as having a monkey mind, a mind plagued by constantly shifting, unorganized thoughts swinging from branch to branch. Allen's ultimate goal for his clients is to achieve a state he calls a mind like water, which reacts appropriately to inputs. A pebble creates a small ripple, a boulder creates a large splash, and then smoothly returns to a calm, flat surface.
And the core foundational mechanism of the GTD system to silence the Zeigarnik effect and achieve that state is the concept of the next action.
Yes. This is massive. If you take nothing else away from this deep dive, take this. Your to-do list should never, ever say something vague like do taxes or plan vacation or fix car.
When your tired brain looks at a list and sees due taxes, it panics. It doesn't know where to start. Does that mean find the receipts? Call the guy. Open the website.
Because it doesn't know the first step, it repulses the list entirely, and you end up procrastinating by scrolling social media.
The list must specify the exact physical next step in the real world. It shouldn't be due taxes. It should be call accountant at 555-1234 to ask for a W-2.
Allen astutely points out that every time you look at a vague task on a list, you are forced into an existential void of decision-making. If you haven't decided the specific physical action required to move the project forward, a part of your brain actively doesn't want to look at the list because it knows it will have to burn glucose to figure it out.
By predefining the next action when you make the list, you close the open loop in your head and remove the friction of getting started.
Which leads us directly into another massive drain on our biology. Decision fatigue. Because every time you step into that existential void to make a choice, even a seemingly fun or trivial choice, you are paying a hidden biological cost.
If you've ever spent a Saturday shopping at the mall and felt completely physically exhausted afterward, even if you didn't walk more than a mile or two, you've experienced this.
Jean Twenge, a researcher who worked in Baumeister's lab, noticed this phenomenon while she was registering for her wedding gifts.
Picking the china patterns, the color of the towels, debating the exact thread count of the bed sheets. By the end of the 4-hour process, she said she was in such a state of cognitive depletion they could have talked her into buying absolutely anything just to make the decisions start.
To test if this was a universal biological reality, the researchers set up a clever experiment with college students. They laid out a table full of various consumer products, pens, scented candles, colored t-shirts.
One group of students had to make a rapid series of active choices between the items. Do you prefer the vanilla candle or the almond candle, the black shirt or the red shirt? They were constantly deciding.
The control group, however, just had to look at the exact same items and give a general opinion on them, but they didn't have to make any definitive, agonizing choices of one over the other.
Afterward, to test the remaining willpower reservoir, researchers timed how long the students could hold their hands submerged in freezing, painful ice water.
The deciders, the ones who had to make the choices, gave up and pulled their hands out of the ice water significantly sooner than the non-deciders.
Just the act of picking a candle over a t-shirt drained their physical pain tolerance.
They proved this again in another study using the Dell computer website.
Right.
They had people use the online customization tool.
One group just looked at the various options. Another group was given a preset list of features and just had to obediently click the buttons to configure it according to the instructions.
But the third group actually had to choose which size hard drive, which type of screen, which processor speed they wanted.
And once again, the group that had to weigh the pros and cons and make the active choices performed the worst on a subsequent psychological willpower test.
Psychologists use what they call the Rubicon model of action phases to describe this cognitive drain. They call it the Rubicon model in reference to Julius Caesar famously crossing the Rubicon River with his army, making the irreversible decision to start a civil war, stating the die is cast.
It represents the point of no return.
The Dell computer experiment proved that crossing the Rubicon, actually pulling the trigger, clicking buy, and making the final binding choice is the most neurologically fatiguing part of the entire human experience. Weighing options is mildly tiring. Finalizing the choice is exhausting.
And the consequences of this fatigue can be terrifyingly high stakes when you scale it up from buying a computer to matters of life and death. Let's look at the judge's dilemma.
Researchers Jonathan Levav and Shai Dansker reviewed over 1,000 decisions made by an Israeli parole board over a 10-month period.
These judges sit in a room and hear cases all day long, back to back, deciding whether to release convicted prisoners back into society on parole. And the data they uncovered revealed an incredibly stark, almost unbelievable pattern.
If a prisoner was lucky enough to appear before the board at 8:50 in the morning, fresh after the judges had arrived, that prisoner had a 65% chance of being granted parole.
But as the morning dragged on and the judges were forced to make complex decision after complex decision, crossing the Rubicon again and again, the approval rate plummeted.
By the time a prisoner appeared right before the mid-morning break, around 10:30 a.m., their chance of parole had dropped to a dismal 15%.
And then the judges take a break, they step out, they eat a sandwich, maybe have a piece of fruit, which we now know restores their blood glucose levels, and immediately after that, snack.
The very next prisoner who walks in sees the parole approval rate shoot right back up to 65%.
But as the afternoon grinds on, decision fatigue sets in again. By 4:25 p.m., at the very end of the day, a prisoner with the exact same crime, the exact same sentence, and the exact same behavior record as a guy seen at 8:50 a.m. has less than a 10% chance of getting out.
The analysis here is absolutely crucial for understanding human nature. The judges are not acting out of malice or conscious bias against the afternoon prisoners. Making decisions about a human being's freedom is incredibly hard, stressful mental work that consumes massive amounts of glucose.
When the brain is fatigued and the tank is empty, it instinctively looks for the safest, easiest default option to conserve energy.
And for a parole board, the default option, the one that requires the least mental wrestling and carries the lowest immediate risk of public blowback to the judge, is to deny parole and leave the person in jail. It maintains the status quo. No decision required.
This mechanism applies to absolutely everything in your life. This is exactly why car salesmen drag out the negotiation process. They make you sit in a little room and choose between 56 different interior fabric colors and 13 kinds of rims and floor mat styles before they finally, an hour later, pitch you on the expensive high-margin rust-proofing package or the extended warranty.
They are deliberately inducing decision fatigue so that your brain just gives up, waves a white flag, and takes whatever default option they suggest just to get out of the dealership.
Now, looking at individuals operating at the absolute highest levels of power and stress imaginable, such as top-tier politicians, we see catastrophic examples of decision fatigue.
Consider Eliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York who ruined his promising career by utilizing a high-end prostitution ring, or Bill Clinton's relationship with a White House intern, or George W. Bush, who famously referred to himself as the decider, navigating the immense, crushing pressures of the presidency during wartime.
And to pause here for a moment, we are impartially reporting the scientific perspective provided in the source material. Regardless of where anyone stands on the politics, policies, or specific actions of these figures across the political spectrum, from a purely neurological standpoint, these are individuals subjected to arguably the most extreme levels of decision fatigue on the planet.
When your cognitive tank is completely empty, after a 14-hour day of making high-stakes life-or-death choices, the brain's ability to exert self-control and logically evaluate the long-term consequences of a personal action is severely compromised.
This biological vulnerability can lead to disastrous personal lapses in judgment that defy logical explanation.
Furthermore, decision fatigue doesn't just make us reckless, it also leads to compromise avoidance and a desperate, irrational desire to keep our options open. Dan Ariely, a brilliant behavioral economist at Duke University, designed a computer game where players clicked on different animated doors to find cash rewards.
But he added a stressful twist. If you didn't click a specific door for a certain amount of time, it would visibly shrink and permanently disappear from the screen.
He found that players would irrationally waste their clicks and actually lose money overall just clicking doors they didn't even want, purely to keep them from closing. The human brain hates losing options, especially when fatigued.
This is exactly why modern online dating apps can be so paralyzing and depressing for people. You open your phone and you have thousands of profiles, thousands of options.
The sheer overwhelming volume of choices completely exhausts your brain's decision-making apparatus within minutes.
Because you are fatigued, you become absurdly picky, looking for any minor flaw as an excuse to swipe left, and you end up going out with less than 1% of the people you see.
But contrast that with old-school speed dating, where you only meet a dozen people in a room and have a strict 2-minute deadline to decide. In that constrained environment, people make matches much more easily and happily. You aren't crushed by the weight of endless options.
And as a fascinating, slightly humorous bonus detail regarding decision-making and evolutionary psychology, researchers found that our cognitive priorities can be hijacked instantly.
They ran a study where they showed heterosexual men photographs of highly attractive women. Immediately after, they tested their financial decision-making.
When offered a classic choice between a small amount of cash right now or a significantly larger amount of cash a month later, men who had just looked at the photos suddenly, overwhelmingly opted for the immediate, smaller cash.
Just looking at the photos completely hijacked their brain's reward center. It shifted their focus entirely to the short-term present, overriding their logical, long-term financial planning. It's wild how easily our decision-making apparatus can be manipulated by our environment.
Which naturally brings us to the question of how we can combat this. How can we better monitor and control these impulsive, fatigued behaviors? This raises an important question. Why did humans evolve self-awareness in the first place?
Right, because for a lot of us, self-awareness just feels like a recipe for teenage angst. It feels like standing in front of the mirror, picking out our physical flaws, and feeling anxious about what other people think of us. What is the evolutionary benefit of that?
Because most animals completely fail the mirror test. If you put a dot of red dye on a dog's head and put the dog in front of a mirror, it just barks at the reflection thinking it's another dog.
Only great apes, dolphins, elephants, and a few others actually realize the dot is on their own body and try to wipe it off.
Psychologists Robert Wicklund and Shelley Duvall initially hypothesized that self-awareness was just inherently unpleasant because it constantly forces us to compare our messy reality to ideal standards. But they ran an ingenious experiment on Halloween to test its actual function.
They set up a house for trick-or-treaters. They put a large bowl of candy on a table in the foyer and told the kids, please only take one piece. Then the researcher would leave the room.
When left entirely alone, as you might expect, many kids naturally grab handfuls of candy.
But then the researchers changed one variable. They placed a large mirror right behind the candy bowl, forcing the kids to look directly at their own reflection as they reached for the bowl.
Suddenly, they acted much more virtuously. Even wearing a mask or a costume, seeing themselves made them stick to the one-piece rule.
So self-awareness didn't evolve just to make us feel bad about our outfits. Psychologists Charles Carver and Michael Shire expanded on this to prove that self-awareness exists purely to aid self-regulation.
It is an evolutionary tool that allows us to step outside ourselves, compare our current behavior against societal norms and our own long-term goals, and course correct before we make a mistake. And the ultimate, most effective tool for outsourcing that self-awareness is tracking your behavior with data.
A phenomenal historical example of this is the 19th century British novelist Anthony Trollope. He worked a highly demanding full-time administrative job at the British Post Office. Yet, he is one of the most prolific and masterful novelists in the English language.
How did he do it? By waking up at 5:30 a.m. every single morning, putting his pocket watch on the table right in front of him, and forcing himself to write exactly 250 words every 15 minutes.
He didn't wait for inspiration or the muse. He used a watch and a word count.
Exactly. Trollope kept a rigorous daily diary of his exact word counts. He famously noted that a week with an insufficient number of pages was a blister to my eye.
The tracking itself, the visible, undeniable data staring back at him, provided the unbending external law that kept him producing when his internal willpower was low.
But today, our lives and our finances are vastly more complicated than a pen and paper can handle. This is where a guy named Aaron Patzer comes in.
He was a software engineer living in Silicon Valley who found himself spending hours every single Sunday manually tracking his expenses on complex spreadsheets just to understand where his money was going.
He finally realized people just don't want to have to be accountants to survive. So he outsourced the grueling grunt work of monitoring to the machines. He coded and created Mint.com, a digital service that automatically pulls your bank data, categorizes your spending into colorful pie charts, and shows you exactly, ruthlessly, where your dollars have gone without you lifting a finger.
The genius of a tool like Mint is how it interacts with the brain. Stanford neuroeconomists actually put people in MRI machines to study what they call the pain of paying. They found that for naturally frugal people, which they term tightwads, just seeing the price tag of an expensive item caused the insula to light up.
The insula is a brain region deeply associated with physical disgust and pain. So tightwads literally feel pain when they spend.
But for natural spendthrifts, there was absolutely no pain reaction in the insula when shopping. It felt great. The only way the researchers could trigger that necessary regulatory disgust response in a spendthrift was to show them a picture of their massive, cumulative, unpaid credit card bill at the end of the month.
So tools like Mint for your money or Rescue Time for tracking exactly how many hours you waste on social media websites or a Fitbit for tracking your daily steps, they do the heavy lifting of monitoring. They hold up the digital mirror.
When you outsource the tracking to a computer, you aren't burning your precious glucose trying to remember how much you spent on coffee this week. You free up your mental energy and your willpower to actually make the behavioral changes.
And when you are looking at your tracked data, whether it's your weight loss or your savings, there is a strategic psychological way to frame it. Eilert Fishbach at the University of Chicago found that your focus should shift depending on your emotional need.
If you are feeling burned out and you want to feel content and satisfied with your work, you should look backward at how far you've come from the starting line. But if you are feeling complacent and you want to be motivated to tackle a new, difficult challenge, you should focus your attention forward on the gap of what you haven't achieved yet.
Okay, so we know how to track our behavior. We know how the ego depletion engine works. We know we need glucose. But the ultimate question remains, can we actually build the muscle? Can we increase the size of the gas tank?
To explore this, let's look at a modern master of extreme willpower. David Blaine, the endurance artist.
This is a guy who stood perfectly still on a 22-inch wide pillar, 100 feet in the air, for 35 hours. He fasted for 44 days, suspended in a glass box over the Thames River in London.
He also spent 63 hours entirely encased in a block of ice in Times Square, which he later described as the absolute toughest stunt of all, fighting off severe, agonizing sleep deprivation and terrifying hallucinations.
And he held his breath on live television with Oprah for 17 minutes and 4 seconds. And he did it even when everything went wrong. His heart rate monitor was placed too close to his ear, and it was constantly beeping and stressing him out. His pulse was racing. His body was screaming for oxygen. He genuinely thought he was having a fatal heart attack by minute 13. But he used his willpower to push through and stay underwater.
Blaine believes he survives these superhuman feats through intense daily training. And not just breath holds, but obsessive tiny micro goals. He'll be out jogging and force himself to step perfectly on the painted logo of a bike lane. If he doesn't hit it perfectly, he feels he's failed. He believes these tiny, completely arbitrary daily acts of discipline physically build his willpower muscle.
While Blaine's stunts are dangerously extreme, the underlying scientific principle he is tapping into is highly valid. Psychologists Mark Merevin, Megan Oten, and Ken Chang wanted to see if normal, everyday people could build their willpower capacity without having to freeze themselves in a block of ice.
They designed a brilliant experiment where they gave college students a completely unrelated, seemingly mundane task. For 2 straight weeks, consciously work on your physical posture. Whenever you catch yourself slouching at your desk or walking, immediately sit or stand up straight.
It sounds so simple, sit up straight. But anyone who has tried it knows that overriding a deeply ingrained, unconscious physical habit like slouching takes constant, low-level exertion of willpower. It's exhausting for the first few days, but after 2 weeks, the students came back to the lab and took standard, highly frustrating psychological self-control tests.
And the result? The students who had simply practiced their posture did significantly better on the willpower test than the control group.
But we must clarify a very key, nuanced distinction here in the science. The posture exercises did not give the students more raw power. When they first started the lab tests on day 1, their initial willpower strength was exactly the same as everyone else's.
What the 2 weeks of posture exercises gave them was more stamina. Their willpower tanks simply didn't drain as fast when subjected to the stress of the test. They became more efficient at utilizing their glucose.
Which means you can practice this yourself right now. You don't need a gym membership for your brain. Try brushing your teeth or opening doors with your non-dominant hand for a week. Or force yourself to speak for an entire day without using abbreviations or filler words like, or like.
Or try completely dropping curse words from your vocabulary. It forces your brain to constantly monitor its own output and override its default lazy settings, which builds your stamina over time.
And the most beautiful, empowering part of this entire field of research is what psychologists refer to as the halo effect of self-control. So, what does this actually mean for the learner?
It means that self-improvement is highly contagious within your own life. When the researchers put people on a rigorous physical fitness program or forced them to stick to a strict money management budget, they obviously got better at working out or saving money. But they didn't just get better at those specific targeted things.
Because all willpower comes from one single reservoir, by building their underlying stamina in the gym or with their wallet, the benefits bled into absolutely every other area of their lives.
They started doing their dishes instead of leaving them in the sink. They smoked fewer cigarettes without even trying to quit. They drank less alcohol. They procrastinated less at work and got the reports done on time.
Incredibly, the data even showed reduced tendencies toward domestic violence and explosive arguments in their personal relationships. By exercising self-control in just one single contained area of your life, you are expanding the capacity and the stamina of that single biological reservoir, granting yourself the power to handle the stress and temptations of all other areas of your life.
That is deeply empowering. It means a small win is actually a massive victory for your whole system.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's recap the journey. We've learned that willpower is not a moral myth. It is a single biological reservoir that powers every act of self-control you exert, from sticking to a diet to being polite to your boss. It is literally fueled by glucose, the sugar in your bloodstream. You drain this precious fuel not just by resisting temptations, but also by making choices, leading to the dangerous reality of decision fatigue.
You can actively protect your reservoir by making highly specific plans, defining the exact next action to quiet the nagging Zeigarnik effect in your unconscious mind. You can use digital tools to rigorously track your behavior, outsourcing the fatigue of self-awareness to a computer. And most importantly, you can actively expand your willpower stamina by practicing small, seemingly unrelated daily habits, like simply sitting up straight or using your left hand to open a door.
It really changes how you view your daily struggles. You aren't weak, you're just depleted.
It does reframe the human experience, and I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If we now scientifically know, without a shadow of a doubt, that human willpower is directly tied to blood glucose levels and decision fatigue, how much of our modern society is fundamentally built backward?
Think about our school systems aggressively scheduling tough, high-stakes math exams right before the lunch bell, when kids' cognitive tanks are completely empty.
Or how we, as adults, routinely schedule our most complex, life-altering career and relationship discussions at 8:00 p.m. after a grueling workday, when we are most prone to fighting. What if the secret to a better, more harmonious society isn't demanding stronger moral character from everyone, but simply recognizing and managing our collective biology?
That is a fascinating paradigm-shifting question to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you step out into the world today with a slightly stronger willpower muscle, a much deeper understanding of your own beautiful, complex brain, and a gentle reminder that the next time you feel completely overwhelmed by life, you might not need a life overhaul. You might just need to grab a healthy snack and make a specific plan. See you next time.